So sexual boundaries differ from one country to another, and it kind of begs the question, why is that? Why is it that here in the United States, different states have different age of consent laws? Why is it that polygamy is considered immoral, and why do we have laws against it? What about bestiality? Could we possibly change our minds on that issue? Personally, I hope not. But, you know, there are certain cultural boundaries, and then there are legal boundaries. We pass laws that kind of dictate the way that we can behave sexually, and then there are certain cultural boundaries. For instance, there's an age gap in some relationships, and some people might be very judgmental if a man in his 40s is dating, let's say, an 18-year-old. Maybe that's not illegal, but it might be frowned upon. So we're going to discuss all of these topics in this very lengthy segment, and I actually want to start off with Jesse. So Jesse, how do we come up with these boundaries? I mean, is this a moral issue, or is there something else at play here?
I do think it's a moral issue, actually. I don't think there's a lot of objective morality operating behind the scenes here, because we do have such tremendous variation with cultural relativism. Ages of consent are tremendously variable. So it's either to reach the conclusion that, you know, we've got the right answer to these questions. We've identified the appropriate age of consent, for instance, and everybody else across the world is wrong. And even in our own society, there's been, you know, major flux in terms of considering, you know, the age of the appropriate age for somebody to have sex with an individual on the other side of the legal line. So, yeah, there's a really interesting history. I think if you look at where 18 came from, you know, it goes back to Victorian era society, really, on the heels of that, and this concern in the UK, really, and we've imported these from British laws with, you know, how old somebody should be when they have sex, not to be exploited or sexually abused. But for a very long time in society, in America, actually, it was as young as 10. Which is just breathtakingly uncomfortable.
Yes, yes.
But 18 really is an arbitrary age. There's no real science that maps onto that number in and of itself.
And that's probably why laws differ state by state here in the U.S. Just to give you guys an idea of how long ago the age of consent was 10. It was about 1880 where the age of consent was 10 in most states, but it ranged from 7 in Delaware to 12 across 9 states in and the District of Columbia. Right. So all of a sudden we finally got to 18, and in some states 16. And it's kind of interesting how we've gotten to that point. And you know, some of our laws are much more strict. For instance, if there's an 18-year-old boy who is having sex with a 16-year-old girl, in some states that's considered a sex crime. And Sandra, I want to get your thoughts on that. I mean, where do you think these types of laws come from, and are we becoming more and more puritanical?
Ooh, that's a good question. Those are all good questions. I mean, in terms of, it's confusing about the whole if one person's over 18 and under 18. Like, I think the window is 3 years for Romeo and Juliet. Yeah.
Some laws have Romeo and Juliet exceptions, but others don't.
Ah, it's so stressful. Are we getting, I don't know, I would like to think that we're not getting more puritanical. I don't know, there's such a fight in our legal way, but I think socially we're getting more relaxed. So I'm hoping that the politics follow the social evolution of us kind of relaxing and kind of getting to a more objective place in terms of how we examine our sexuality and how it relates to the rest of our lives. But sometimes politics don't follow the social cues, because depending on who's lobbying the hardest. But
so, Dave, what's the role of the government when it comes to regulating sexual behavior? I mean, it's interesting because you have one party that claims that they're for small government, the Republicans, and they're always saying, like, we want the government outside of our lives. They should have the smallest role possible. But then they're also the party that wants to regulate sexual behavior as much as possible. What do you think the role of government should be when it comes to regulating sexual behavior?
Well, I mean, the Republicans are obviously total hypocrites on this, because they want the government so small it can fit inside a woman's uterus where then they can control it. So obviously that's ridiculous. Look, you have to have some laws. You have to have some numbers. So the 18 thing, you have to have something that is the limit. Whether that's arbitrary or not, or where we got that, or how that changes as society changes, is something else. But you need some kind of number. It's crazy to me that we had numbers as low as 7 and 10. Like, it's actually sick. You really can't, it's hard to wrap your brain around it, how that was even thought of as decent. But the government pretty much, beyond setting the standards of, let's say, 18 for consent and dealing with the Romeo and Juliet thing, really should have very little to do with what you do in your bedroom. But yeah, beyond the number, the government should have almost nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to rape, when it comes to kids and sexual exploitation, the government should play some sort of role. But when it comes to things like polygamy, I think that the lines get a little blurred. So I want to discuss that a little bit because, of course, here in the United States we have laws against polygamy, and I kind of want to ask why that is, Jesse.
For no good reason, really. I mean, it actually is in conflict with our evolutionary heritage in terms of having multiple sex partners.
Oh, really?
Tens of thousands of years ago.
Can you elaborate on that a little?
Well, you mentioned the title of my last book, which is Why is the Penis Shaped Like That? And if you actually extrapolate from the design and do some reverse engineering in the appearance of the human penis, and you compare that to our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, it looks very different. And I worked with chimpanzees as a graduate student. So I saw too many chimpanzee penises, I think, growing up.
I've never heard that sentence before.
But we have a very distinctive phallus in the sense of having this glans head with a coronal ridge beneath. And the best theoretical interpretation for why it's shaped like that is that it was designed to pull out the seminal fluid or the sperm cells of males that had sex with the same female partner within a 48-hour period of time, which is the average lifespan of a sperm cell. Now, whether the female in that relationship was engaging in sex with multiple male partners consensually or willingly, or without her consent is a different question, I think. Mm-hmm. But it does suggest that monogamy is not obviously natural. Now, I think it's also problematic to just simply say that whatever is natural or unnatural,
we should just run with it. We should
just simply go with, because there are lots of things that are natural that I think we need to think more deeply about in terms of whether we act on those desires, for instance, when it comes to sex.
Sandra, do you want to jump in?
So many things just happened in my mind. I'm like, penises are like reverse plungers. Cool, weird, cool. Never heard that before. I'm so appreciative of that knowledge. I'm thinking about the fact that, yeah, what is natural is not necessarily healthy. And I think what we don't have is our models of what is healthy in terms of relationships, in terms of an older person and a younger person being together, or like what does a marriage with multiple partners look like in a health, like why is everyone getting their needs met? Is everyone mentally healthy? And like that's what we don't have, and so we start making laws before we really know what the baseline is.
And I've been thinking, that we are spending far too much time talking about what's not in this conversation, but I think broadly as a society, what is natural and what is normal. We're sort of we're oddly focused on these questions, and normal is really just a number. There's no intrinsic moral value that's associated with this question of what's normal. The subtitle of my book, Sexual Deviant in All of Us, I use the expression sexual deviant just as a statistical construct. There's nothing in and of itself that suggests that it's wrong or it's right. We really need to be spending more time, I think, identifying clearly and articulating the question of harm. What is harmful to different parties? Just because we would be harmed by a certain act or a sexual encounter doesn't mean that other people necessarily would be harmed by that encounter.
Yeah, so we have so many laws on the books where, there will be two consenting adults doing something, some sort of sexual behavior, and it's considered illegal. They will face some sort of consequence for the behavior they're involved in, whether it's polygamy or it is prostitution, for instance. So what is at play behind the scenes, Dave? Why do you think it is that we have laws on the books banning polygamy, for instance?
I mean, the government wants to control us is the sort of simple answer to that. So, look, gay marriage is slowly coming around, and everybody, it was so based in fear why we were against it. It's going to affect the sanctity of straight marriage, and, people are going to be having all kinds of crazy sex. Or even if you look at Don't Ask, Don't Tell, like all these things that are based in sex, they usually prove to not be true. You know what I mean? It hasn't harmed our military in any way. Gay marriage hasn't affected straight marriage anyway. If anything, it's probably strengthened the family because more people are who they are, and only goodness comes from that. But the government has to set, at least the way it works for us, the government has to set some sort of rules. Otherwise, I guess everyone would do whatever they want, and then what's the point of a government? I don't know. Like, I don't really believe that personally, but I think that's what their angle would be.
That is the fear.
Right, that's the fear.
The slippery slope.
I think a lot of these laws do have a lot to do with religion and so-called morality. And of course, what's moral to one person isn't necessarily moral to another. I mean, two consenting adults behaving in some sexual manner doesn't bother me at all. It doesn't have any impact on my life. But there are certain people who think think, oh my God, that behavior will lead to, you know, the destruction of society, the destruction of, you know, the traditional family. Exactly. And speaking of marrying horses, let's talk about bestiality a little bit, because I think that's actually a weird topic of debate online that I am shocked by, because every once in a while we will do a story on the Young Turks where some guy is caught having sex with a horse. Rodel. We've done many updates on Rodel. He had sex with the same horse twice, got arrested twice for the same behavior, and he actually gave that horse an infection, which is crazy. I'm not kidding. That is one of the most memorable stories I've ever done on the show.
That's cruel.
But one person, not one person, several people will make the argument that, well, why do you think that bestiality doesn't have anything to do with consent? There are cases where a dog, for instance, will go to a woman and start doing what it does. So could a case be made that bestiality is okay?
Yeah, there are interesting philosophical questions.
Yeah, like so can you address that?
I mean, way back in the 1948, when Alfred Kinsey wrote his famous book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, looking at American males, you know, sort of revealing the erotic secrets, he found that half of all what he called farm-bred adolescent males confessed to having some sexual encounter or relationship with livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, cows, you name it. But his interpretation of, at that time at least, was that they were using the animal as a surrogate for a human partner. They couldn't get for a straight boy, they couldn't get a female partner. For a gay boy, they couldn't get a male partner, so they had sex with an animal instead. But more recently, this is the more interesting part, more recently, within about the past decade or so, scientists have actually identified a group of people who are certifiable zoophiles. They're actually they prefer to have sex with animals over humans. It's not like they're using the animals as a surrogate. They would rather have sex with an animal. So I've gotten some really interesting emails. I got an email from a really articulate, elegant lawyer that was talking about how he, from his earliest memories, he would go to the library. You know, other boys were looking at Playboy magazine. He was checking out books, illustrated images of horses and masturbating to them when he was a teenager. He didn't understand it, where it came from. He married a woman, and the only way that he could consummate the relationship was by imagining that she was a horse. That
marriage, my God, I'm gonna
the marriage
die.
Didn't last, which maybe isn't terribly surprising.
That is unbelievable. Okay, so what is your take on that, though? I mean, you did a good job explaining it, but is it okay?
No, I think that I'm not advocating it necessarily, but I do think there are interesting questions here. Let's say that we've got two cases of a horse that's ejaculating. One horse is owned by a woman who is a zoophile. She's been a zoophile all of her life. She's got this little farm. She comes into the stable occasionally, and she sees the horse with an erection. She gently masturbates that horse. She's deriving sexual gratification from this experience. She's very sensitive to any sort of discomfort or any distress on the part of the horse in terms of her intuition, at least what's happening in its mind. And compare that with a stud manager that owns a racehorse farm, and there's a very expensive stallion, and for breeding purposes, this manager needs to acquire the sperm of that racehorse, and the only way to really get it, if you're not a zoophile at least, is to insert a electrified anal rod into its rectum, which is quite painful to electroejaculate it. What he's doing is actually, on the books, it's legal. What she's doing is illegal. And I think that reveals this reveals how we are so uncomfortable with interspecies sex. And I'm a platonic animal lover, I should say. So this is not, a difficult.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Oftentimes a very difficult question. You know, it's a difficult issue for me to even talk about. But I do think that we need to be intellectually honest and consistent with our thinking about harm when it comes to sexuality. So I think that's, you know, we don't belabor this question of getting consent of animals before we slaughter them.
Right.
So Sandra,
for food.
No, that's such a great point, because if we're going to be consistent and if we're concerned about harm for the animal, then how are we electrocuting an animal and being like, that's cool?
For commercial reasons.
Right. I mean, there's money to be made.
Clearly, it's not about harm for the animal, but there's
we're
it
disgusted
doesn't
by
line
sex
up.
with
There's
animals,
there's feelings. We're having feelings, and we're trying to put words to it.
Right.
And saying that, but
couldn't one make the argument that both are harmful, and
Absolutely.
so both should be outlawed?
But we aren't doing it.
We're not. So there is a lack of consistency there. But I mean, we have a long history of mistreating animals, and that's something that we have to address at some point.
Yeah, I think the next step in this whole thing is that we're going to be having sex with robots in our lifetime.
We actually are.
We're already doing it.
That's
I mean,
inevitable.
they already have things that you can, there's that underwear that you can strap on, and then someone at the other end of the internet can, figure out how they're
The
going
ultimate wireless.
to manipulate you and all that thing, and girls have bras for it and all that kind of
Pornography
stuff.
drives technology.
It does. Pornography killed the beta tape, right?
That's
because
right.
they went with VHS. So, yeah, we're going to be having sex with robots. So it's going to be very old school to have sex with animals, because you're going to have
An
like
animal
a
robot.
sex bot, or you're going to have
Yeah.
like a hologram.
Well, to me,
of a
that's
chick
to me that's qualitatively different though, because when you're comparing like an animal versus a robot, the animal actually has a neurological system that is capable of experiencing harm and pain and suffering. A robot, by definition, is not a subjectively experiencing organism, so
Right.
it can't
Not
be
yet,
harmed.
anyway.
So
Until
I
they
say
take
let's
over.
have as many robots as we possibly can.
I guess
Pro robot sex.
I am, yes.
for me, it's acknowledging that people can be like oriented. Like, my orientation is horse, and then dividing that away from the actual having sex with a horse and being like,
Yeah.
and being like, duh, you are wrong for how you feel. It's like, well,
What if
are
the
we
horse
gonna-
is mounting you?
I
Which in
wondered.
fact- which in fact
do you
does-
think like who's penetrating who?
This question is insane. I mean, I'm trying hard to be as open-minded as possible, but I just find it really hard to believe that an animal can consent to having sex. And I'm not saying that the way we treat animals currently is okay. The electrocution is not okay. The way we treat animals prior to killing them so we can eat them is not okay. I agree with all of that. But at the same time, how do you say, like, yeah, that dog totally consented to having sex with a human?
That's a jump. That's a
Even
big jump.
even
Right?
just sort of entertaining these types of questions, I think, gives the message that somehow you are advocating it or you're sort of
Right.
in favor of it. Just simply playing around with the philosophical ideas, which to me is sad, because I think that we really do need to think more deeply about this. I think that sometimes we need to shake off our social complacency with what we expect is normal, what we expect to be normal, and what the majority of society actually is.
I think what we can take away from the segment is it's important to be as open-minded as possible and to ask these questions. And as long as there isn't a party that's being hurt, there's really no place for the government to get involved and tell us what we can and can't do. When there are two consenting adults that are behaving in a certain way, and no one's getting hurt in the process, there's really no point in dictating what they do or regulating what they do.
And by that you mean an adult horse as well, I think.
Well, if two adult horses want to have sex with one another, then I'm all for it. You guys, do you. But
We are animals, let's not forget. I mean, I think that we have a tendency maybe to bambify other species.
no, well, I'm not an animal. I'm different right now.
This is a great segment because we're intellectually processing, like we're all I'm having feelings, but at the same time it's like we're able to go, oh, I'm having feelings. Like,
We need to be pushed into an uncomfortable corner.
and just
so-
like be like, just sit with that. Like, whoa,
Yeah.
look at me feeling things.
Yeah, definitely. You have to address things that you might feel uncomfortable talking about, but if you don't talk about it, then you're never going to come to a good conclusion.